Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we conclude with part 2 of The Mystery of the Feathered Serpent by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from The All-Seeing Eye, Volume 5, Number 11, August 1931. The Mystery of the Feathered Serpent continued by Manly P. Hall. On a certain day in the mythological country of Tlapalan, 3 sisters were sitting together in their home when there suddenly appeared in their midst a heavenly apparition so fearsome in appearance that 2 of the sisters died of fright upon beholding it. To the 3rd sister, who seemed strangely calm, the spirit addressed itself, declaring that it had come as an ambassador from the god of the Milky Way to search on earth for a virgin called Chimalman or Xochiquetzal, who was to bear a son by an immaculate conception and whose name was to be Quetzalcoatl. The tradition then declares that the father of Quetzalcoatl was the great god Ometecutli, who is called the Lord of our flesh, and who was the direct creator of mankind. No one apparently has noticed the first 2 significant letters of this god's name, This can scarcely be a coincidence. The omnific name of the creator commences with these 2 letters in so many of the ancient mystical systems. Here is a definite link with the metaphysics of Asia. Lord Kingsborough notes the significant fact that the name Xochiquetzal signifies in the ancient dialects the lifting up of roses, and that in the Islamic traditions concerning the birth of Christ, he was conceived as the result of the Virgin Mary smelling of a rose. In another tradition, the god Ometecutli, who was the personification of the procreative attributes of abstract divinity, is declared to have overshadowed the Virgin Xochiquetzal as an invisible spiritual being, impregnating her with his breath, so that Quetzalcoatl was the breath-born son of a divine father and a human mother. Here we have a parallel to Pythagoras, whose father is supposed to have been the god Apollo, or Jesus conceived of the Holy Ghost, which literally means spiritual air or breath. And again in the folklore of Britain, the magician Merlin, whose father was an invisible creature, a fire salamander or dragon, and his mother a vestal. In due time, the child Quetzalcoatl was born, his birth being accompanied with the mysterious omens and wonders in the heavens which always accompany a divine incarnation. Some legends affirm that when he entered into terrestrial life, he was already perfect in wisdom, so that even as a babe he had the reasoning faculties of a man. There are fantastic stories to the effect that he issued into this life wearing his plumed bonnet and adored alike by gods and men. There are accounts that Quetzalcoatl was the youngest of the 7 sons of Ometecutli, but the more persistent tradition is that he was the one and only son of his heavenly father, and that he came into this world only for a short time to act as a mediator and to reinstate a relapsed humanity in the favor of the heavenly one. The Aztec chronicles state definitely that Quetzalcoatl is the only one of the gods who ever actually possessed the body of a man. All of the other deities were incorporeal, existing in an ozonic state like the god of the Christians, who is regarded as being everywhere at all times. Thus, Quetzalcoatl fulfills all the requisites of the Platonic definition of a demigod. He is the Superman, the link between heaven and earth, who of his own nature constitutes the bridge which connects the 2 worlds. He is the Son through whom all men must come unto the Father. Quetzalcoatl was born on the day of the 7 Cains, and as in the case of nearly all divine children. Tradition is silent as to his childhood years. There is a rumor of greatness but no distinct account. At this point, a considerable difficulty arises in an effort to reconcile several legendary accounts. According to some stories, Quetzalcoatl was actually born in Tolan and ruled over that Toltec state as its prince, but the most popular legend declares that he departed from Tlapalan and appeared at Vera Cruz, either riding upon a raft of serpents or being carried in a magical canoe made from the skins of snakes. In appearance, he is generally represented as a man of mature years, even a patriarch with a long beard and fair white skin. The image of him in the pyramid of Cholula, however, depicts the god as black, his body adorned with astronomical symbols. When seen upon the raft, Quetzalcoatl was covered from shoulders to feet in a black robe, which was ornamented with a fringe of white crosses. Upon his head was a magnificent bonnet of Quetzal plumes, and he carried a magic wand with which he performed all those wonders ascribed to Moses' sacred staff. With this wand, he controlled invisible creatures and was continually surrounded with magical forces. When Quetzalcoatl took over the affairs of the Toltec nation, The people were suffering from droughts and famines, so that great distress was upon the face of the land. Knowing that sin was the curse of the fourth age, and that the departure of men from the piety prescribed by the divinities was responsible for their tribulation, Quetzalcoatl set himself the task of reordering Toltec culture. Among other things, he instituted sacrifices to the gods and revived the interest in spiritual things. His offerings, however, were of no avail until at last he offered his own blood for the redemption of his people. He inflicted several wounds upon his own body and, catching the blood in sacred utensils, offered it as a covenant to the deities. We remember that Odin, in German Wotan, wounded himself with his own spear that he might be qualified to enlighten the world. Both Odin and Quetzalcoatl became gods of thieves, even as Christ was crucified with thieves, and one of the names by which Quetzalcoatl was known in the Mexican mysteries was Wotan. One of the Spanish authors calls attention to the fact that many of the criminals of Mexico worshipped Quetzalcoatl, and Odin was the patron of executed criminals, because he voluntarily hung himself from a branch of the Tree of Life. The self-inflicted wounds by which Quetzalcoatl appeased the heavenly wrath were made with sacred thorns, which reminds one of the wreath of thorns. There is most certainly a connection between all of these curious correspondences, but others more startling come to light as we proceed. At last, to signify that they had accepted the sacrifices and had forgiven the sins of the people, the Toltec gods on their high Olympus sent a lizard as their messenger to inform Quetzalcoatl that the period of his penance had come to an end. The Valley of Mexico then blossomed as a rose, and all good things came to the people. Prescott writes, during his residence on Earth, he, Quetzalcoatl, instructed the natives in husbandry and the arts of government. His influence was most benign. Under his tutelage, the people were happy. The air was filled with intoxicating perfumes and the sweet melody of birds. The halcyon days he spent with his people represented to them the golden age of Anahuac. At his command, the earth teemed with fruits and flowers without the pains of culture. An ear of Indian corn was as much as a man could carry. The cotton as it grew took of its own accord the rich dyes of human art. Wherever he went, all manners of singing birds bore him company, emblems of the whistling breeze. Thus we see the great magician, with a wave of his magic wand, re-established paradise upon the earth, and over his happy realm he ruled in the capacity of a priest rather than a king. Concerning the personal life of Quetzalcoatl, contradictions also exist. Some declare that he was a celibate initiate living in the true manner of a priest, concerning himself only with the spiritual well-being of the race. Other accounts refer to his consort, Quetzalcoatl, who is described as the female counterpart or complement of himself. Here we have the Oriental doctrine of Shaktis, in which each divinity is completed by a female attribute, usually personifying the gentler virtues of the divinity. Even the accounts of the Mayas on the peninsula of Yucatan agree that it would be a mistake to consider Quetzalcoatl, or to them Kukulkan, as a king or temporal ruler. He placed princes upon thrones and defended the dignity of states, but remained ever aloof from temporal entanglements, too high and too far removed to enter into the petty disputes of men. In the Mexican legends of Quetzalcoatl appear fragmentary bits of significant symbolic lore. We read of the temptation of Quetzalcoatl, how during his penance the spirits of evil came to him and tried to divert him from his course. In another place is the account of his fasting for 40 days, which later became a definite part of the Mexican religious ritual. Then there is the cup, which was given to him to drink in a mystic sacrament, and one of his many titles was that of the Morning Star. Throughout the Toltec mythology, he is the Lord of the Eastern Light and must be regarded as a solar divinity as well as a wind spirit. One of his many appellations in the ancient language signifies a vine or the juice thereof. Wotan, which means the human heart, was a term sacred to him. And the Mexicans had a ceremony in which they made a model of his body from dough which they baked and then divided amongst themselves and ate with great solemnity. Lord Kingsborough calls attention to the fact that according to the old Jewish prophecies, the Messiah who was to come to Israel was to be of marred or deformed countenance, and that his person would be without beauty. Quetzalcoatl fulfills this requirement exactly. Nearly all of the images which have been found of him have been mutilated in the face, and those not thus disfigured show the divinity as of most unprepossessing countenance. Usually deeply wrinkled and with a single protruding tooth, Among the Mayan legends is one to the effect that although Quetzalcoatl was held in high esteem by millions of devoted subjects and followers, he brought down upon himself the animosity of the priestcraft, probably because he delivered his people from bondage to the ignorance and superstitions by which these wily sorcerers maintained their own fortune and dignity. They plotted in many ways to destroy him, and at least on one occasion actually brought him to the sacrificial stone. But his magic seems to have been greater than theirs, and he was victorious over his priestly adversaries. The myth of the dying god is certain evidence of the presence of the mystery ritual. Therefore, we seek in the legend of Quetzalcoatl for this all-important keynote, nor do we need to seek far, for the curious illuminations in the Vatican Codex reveal the whole story. Here are numerous representations of the god crucified, and even with curious marks resembling nail wounds in his hands and feet. To quote again from Lord Kingsborough, the 73rd page of the Borgian manuscript is the most remarkable of all. For Quetzalcoatl is not only represented there as crucified upon a cross of Greek form, but his burial and descent into hell are also depicted in a very curious manner. After forcing the Lord of the Underworld to pay him homage, Quetzalcoatl rises victoriously from the grave, thus perfecting in every part the mystical system which he had come to institute. At just what period in his life the crucifixion episode took place, we cannot discover. But as in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, the elements involved are metaphysical rather than physical, and the date would be of no great value. At this point, the cosmic myth again mingles itself with what may be, at least in part, an historical account. We cannot tell just what connection exists between the golden age of Quetzalcoatl, which crowned the allegorical story of the Toltec civilization. But we do know that the civilization itself, weakened by internal decay and the deterioration of moral fabric, was overthrown by other Nahua tribes led by the sorcerer god Tezcatlipoca. This demon elected himself the adversary of Quetzalcoatl and determined to break the reign and power of the magician priest. At this point, Quetzalcoatl seems to become, for at least an instant, identical with the Toltec nation itself and Tezcatlipoca and his two fellow conspirators with 3 tribes of Nahua barbarians. It is said, for instance, that Tezcatlipoca, assuming the appearance of an aged man, gained audience with Quetzalcoatl and as a physician prescribed a remedy for an illness which had befallen the aged priest. The medicine which Tezcatlipoca gave Quetzalcoatl was in reality pulque, an intoxicating drink which benumbed the senses of Quetzalcoatl. The story evidently intends to convey that the evil spirits drugged the Toltec Empire and brought about its destruction through dissipation and intemperance. Quetzalcoatl remained with the Toltecs until his empire was so demoralized by the schemings and plottings, probably of his political enemies, that it was no longer possible to maintain the integrity of the people. Feeling that the task which he had come to accomplish was ended, and that there was no further good which he could accomplish for the Toltecs, Quetzalcoatl departed from Tolan to return to Tlapalan, the mysterious Orient from which he had come. Departing from the city which he had elevated to dignity, he set out in his very advancing years for Cholula, which was to be his first important stopping place. That his treasures should not fall into the hands of the demon Tezcatlipoca, he destroyed the buildings which he had erected, hid his treasures and jewels in caverns over which he caused mountains to appear by magic. With a wave of his wand, in the words of Lewis Spence, he changed the cocoa trees into mesquites and ordered all of the birds of rich plumage and song to quit the valley of Anahuac and to follow him in his pilgrimage. Thus he left the land as he had found it, a desert, and his curse has remained upon it. His adversaries, seeing that he was rendering valueless the land which they were striving to steal from him, besought him to reveal before his departure the secrets of smelting, of painting, and lapidary which he had communicated to his chosen people. But the god refused and continued his journey, preceded by musicians who played soft melodies to cheer his weary footsteps. In some accounts, it is stated that Quetzalcoatl remained for 20 years in Cholula. Others give a much shorter period for his stay. In honor of his presence there, the Great Pyramid was built, From Cholula, in one account, he continued onto the shore of the Gulf of Mexico, where he called to the sea, and there immediately appeared above the water the wizard skiff of serpent skins drawn by dragons. Turning to his followers gathered upon the shore, the aged Quetzalcoatl made the prophecy that was to prove the future undoing of the Aztec Empire. He said that in a later age he would come back and with his descendants establish the fifth great epoch, which would bring with it the permanent paradise of which the Eden he had invoked by magic was but a taste. Then, stepping into his ship, he disappeared over the curved mystery of the horizon, returning to his son-father who had called him back to the fabled land of Tlapalan. There is also another account of the passing of Quetzalcoatl, which, though entirely different, also possesses much symbolic interest. In the Aztec mythology is described how the aged prince, Feathered Serpent, after his departure from Cholula, journeyed as far as Quetzalcoatl, where he died full of years and honored for his wisdom. His body was carried in a stately procession to the high peak of Mount Orizaba, where, as the multitudes gathered about it, it was consumed by a divine flame which descended from heaven, as in the passing of Zoroaster, the Persian fire Magus. As the flames surrounded his body, there appeared in the midst of the conflagration a bird of such magnificence that its plumage darkened the flames by contrast. It was the spirit of Quetzalcoatl ascending to heaven in the royal guise of the peacock. Lewis Spence gives a still different account of the passing of the Feathered Serpent magician. He writes that Quetzalcoatl cast himself upon a funeral pyre and was consumed, and that the ashes rising from the conflagration flew upward and were changed into birds of brilliant plumage. His heart also soared into the sky and became the morning star. The Mexicans averred that Quetzalcoatl died when the star became visible, and thus they bestowed upon him the title Lord of the Dawn. They further said that when he died he was invisible for 4 days, and that for 8 days he wandered in the underworld, after which time the morning star appeared, when he achieved resurrection and ascended his throne as a god. That certain parts of the Quetzalcoatl legend have an astronomical interpretation is quite evident. The Mexicans had periods composed of what they called the binding of years. These bindings contained 52 years and constituted a cycle. According to traditions, the end of the world would occur at the termination of one of these 52-year cycles. Therefore, this period was always marked with greatest solemnity, and the new year was announced when the stars of the Pleiades passed the zenith on the fatal day. This passage promised an extension of 52 years to the life of the empire, and during the period of Aztec supremacy, human sacrifices were offered to propitiate the gods at this time that they might prolong the duration of the world. Quetzalcoatl remained in Mexico for 52 years, one of these binding periods, and, as has already been noted, the Spaniards also arrived on one of these psychological periods. Quetzalcoatl disappeared from the sight of men after the great 52-year festival at Cholula, journeying in the magical direction of all great initiates towards the east, his eternal home. Humboldt says that at the end of the 52-year cycle, the Aztecs extinguished all their lights, a peculiar ceremony which the Druids performed annually. The Indians also at this period crucified a victim, believing that by this crucifixion they would gain a respite from the destructive powers of the gods. In closing this article on the Quetzalcoatl myth, we would simply recall the form in which the god is worshipped, namely either as a man bearded and aged, wearing a bonnet of quetzal plumes and riding upon a serpent, or else in his true hieroglyphic form, as a feathered snake with rattles either coiled or with its tail raised in a defiant gesture. The worship of the serpent throughout the world is associated with the redemption of mankind through the serpent power moving in the spinal cord. This is the true wand of the magician through which the mysteries of divine magic are performed. Quetzalcoatl was both an instructor in these mysteries and also the very personification of his own rites. There was probably more than one Quetzalcoatl, for his initiates and disciples assumed the name and symbols of their master. Hence, the Aztec conqueror Kukulkan should not be identified with the original myth, but was an American Napoleon who conquered in the name of the god, bore his title as one of dignity, and built monuments in his honor throughout Central America, Mexico, and the northern parts of South America. Quetzalcoatl was a god of peace, but the Aztecs spread his cult with the sword, thereby following the precedent of nearly all great world religions. One cannot but be amazed in reviewing the traditions in connection with this remarkable occult allegory of the feathered snake and the culture for which it stood. Here, in what is erroneously called the New World, the occult forces of nature were cultivated before Europe had emerged from a state of barbarism. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.